Transylvania. When you hear that name, your mind probably jumps to vampires and Gothic castles. But this was actually America's almost 14th colony, and it came surprisingly close to reshaping our entire map. Right now, as you're watching this in 2025, there are territories and regions across America that nearly became the 51st, 52nd, or even 53rd state. Some had nearly 1 million residents, others had congressional approval, and a few were just one signature away from statehood. These stories still resonate in 2025 as America grapples with deep political divides between regions and their distant state capitals. We are counting down 12 proposed states that almost joined the Union and revealing what happened to these forgotten territories in our modern era. Transylvania, from colonial dreams to modern Kentucky. Number 12, Transylvania, first proposed in 1775. The mastermind behind this colonial scheme was Richard Henderson, a former North Carolina judge who abandoned his comfortable courtroom career in 1773 to chase fortune in land speculation. Henderson formed the Transylvania Company with several business partners, all convinced they could carve out their own piece of American territory before the Revolutionary War changed everything. Their target was the vast wilderness beyond the Appalachian Mountains, where few European settlers had ventured, but Cherokee tribes had lived for generations. Henderson's plan hinged on a single day, March 17, 1775. At Sycamore Shoals in present-day Tennessee, Henderson orchestrated what he called a legitimate land purchase from the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee leaders who signed the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals handed over about 17 million acres of territory in exchange for goods worth about 10,000 pounds, muskets, ammunition, clothing, and other trade items. Henderson walked away believing he owned more land than some European countries. But the deal was rotten from the start. Cherokee chief Dragging Canoe warned Henderson that the land was dark and bloody ground and predicted violence would follow any attempt at settlement. Many Cherokee leaders refused to recognize the treaty, claiming the signatories had no authority to sell ancestral lands. The British Crown immediately declared the purchase illegal under the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited private land deals with native tribes. Virginia and North Carolina were even more hostile, insisting the territory already belonged to them under their original colonial charters. Henderson ignored these objections and pressed forward. He established the town of Boonesborough and created a colonial government complete with elected representatives and written laws. For a brief moment in 1775, Transylvania functioned as an independent colony with its own legislature and judicial system. Henderson even petitioned the Continental Congress for recognition as the 14th American colony, arguing that Transylvania deserved the same status as Pennsylvania or Virginia. The Continental Congress crushed Henderson's dreams without ceremony. In 1778, they rejected Transylvania's petition outright, refusing to even consider it as a legitimate colonial entity. Virginia's powerful delegation made it clear that recognizing Henderson's land grab would set a dangerous precedent for private companies creating their own territories. The Revolutionary War then sealed Transylvania's fate as political priorities shifted to fighting Britain rather than sorting out competing territorial claims. By 1776, Henderson's colonial experiment was collapsing. Virginia began issuing its own land grants in Kentucky, ignoring Henderson's claims entirely. North Carolina did the same in Tennessee. Without legal recognition from Congress or support from existing colonies, Henderson had no way to enforce his territorial boundaries or govern the growing number of settlers flooding into the region. The Transylvania Company dissolved in legal challenges and financial ruin, leaving Henderson personally bankrupt and politically irrelevant. The failure of Henderson's speculative venture paved the way for what actually happened to this territory. Western Kentucky, where Henderson dreamed of establishing his capital, now houses over 1.2 million residents across major cities like Louisville, Bowling Green, and Owensboro. Northern Tennessee, the other half of proposed Transylvania, is home to more than 800,000 people in cities like Knoxville and Nashville's expanding metropolitan area. These aren't struggling frontier settlements, they're thriving economic centers that Henderson could never have imagined. Modern political movements to reunite these historical Transylvania territories are essentially non-existent. Kentucky and Tennessee have developed distinct political cultures and economic interests over 250 years of separate statehood. Kentucky leans Republican in presidential elections but maintains Democratic traditions in state politics, while Tennessee has become solidly Republican across all levels of government. The idea of combining these regions into a single political entity has no contemporary support or practical justification. Henderson's Transylvania represents one of history's most spectacular examples of failed speculation, creating unexpected success. His colonial dreams collapsed in legal challenges and political opposition, but that failure allowed these territories to develop into two of America's most culturally distinctive regions. Kentucky became synonymous with bourbon, horses, and coal, while Tennessee created Nashville's music empire and Smoky Mountain tourism. Henderson's broken colonial vision ultimately produced something far more valuable than anything his Transylvania company could have built. But Henderson's naming strategy was at least creative compared to what came next. Some proposed states took a much more straightforward approach to choosing their identity. Delm Marva, the peninsula that almost became America's Delaware Plus. Number 11, Delm Marva, first proposed in 1776. The Delm Marva Peninsula demonstrates exactly how residents felt when carved up between three different states. Delaware claims the northern section, Maryland controls the middle portion, and Virginia owns the southern tip. This 180-mile strip of land jutting out from Maryland's eastern coast created awkward political divisions that frustrated residents since colonial times, generating perfect conditions for statehood movements whenever peninsula dwellers felt ignored by their distant state capitals. The first serious push for peninsula independence came just months after America declared independence from Britain. In November 1776, while Maryland's founding fathers were busy drafting their Declaration of Rights, Peninsula delegates attempted a political sleight of hand that nearly worked. They quietly tried to slip a secession clause into Maryland's founding documents that would allow regions to break away from the state whenever they wanted. The language was deliberately vague and buried in technical legal text, designed to fly under the radar of mainland delegates who weren't paying close attention to the fine print. But mainland Maryland politicians weren't as distracted as peninsula delegates hoped. They spotted the secession language and killed it immediately, recognizing that allowing any region to leave at will would doom Maryland's political unity before it even got started. The peninsula delegates had overplayed their hand, revealing their separatist intentions too early in the process. Their failure taught future statehood advocates that subtlety and patience would be essential for any successful independence movement. The lesson paid off 57 years later when peninsula politicians tried a completely different approach. Instead of creating a brand new state, Delaware lawmakers proposed simply absorbing Maryland's eastern shore into their existing territory in 1833. This annexation strategy seemed far more realistic than demanding Congress create an entirely new state from scratch. Delaware already had statehood, established government institutions, and representation in Congress. Adding Maryland's eastern shore would just expand Delaware's boundaries rather than requiring complex constitutional procedures for admitting new states. The annexation proposal gained momentum with shocking speed. The Delaware legislature passed the resolution through both chambers without significant opposition. Delaware politicians saw clear benefits in expanding their tiny state's territory and population base. The proposal then crossed state lines and somehow passed the Maryland House of Delegates, despite representing a direct loss of Maryland territory and tax revenue. Everything came down to the Maryland Senate, where Eastern Shore annexation faced its final political test. Peninsula residents watched nervously as Maryland senators debated whether to voluntarily surrender a chunk of their state to Delaware. The Eastern Shore delegation argued passionately that geographic separation from mainland Maryland created insurmountable governance problems. They pointed to poor roads, unreliable ferry service, and communication delays that left Peninsula residents feeling politically abandoned. But the Maryland Senate ultimately refused to dismember their state. The annexation proposal died by a narrow margin, crushing what had been the closest any Delm Marva statehood movement would ever come to success. Peninsula residents had passed through 3 separate legislative chambers and needed just one more vote to fundamentally reshape the mid-Atlantic political map. The failure of 1833 annexation didn't kill Peninsula independence dreams permanently. In 1992, frustrated residents formed the Delm Marva State Party to revive statehood arguments for the modern era. Party organizers pointed out that the peninsula's population had reached roughly 750,000 people, which exceeded South Dakota's population and qualified for statehood under any reasonable demographic standard. They projected peninsula growth to 922,000 residents within a few decades, creating an even stronger case for independent statehood. The 1992 movement emphasized economic and political arguments that resonated with contemporary peninsula concerns. Advocates argued that 3-state political division created unnecessary bureaucratic complexity and prevented coordinated regional economic development. They pointed to successful peninsula-wide cooperation on environmental issues like Chesapeake Bay restoration as evidence that the region already functioned as a single economic and ecological unit. But the Delm Marva State Party failed to generate the political momentum needed for serious statehood consideration. The movement gradually faded from public attention as founders aged out of activism and younger residents showed little interest in continuing the independence campaign. By 2000, organized peninsula statehood advocacy had essentially disappeared. Today's Delm Marva Peninsula houses around 1 million residents spread across its 3-state political structure. The peninsula's modern political dynamics reflect what could be called Brexit-style regional politics, where geographic identity competes with state-level party loyalty. Peninsula voters often share more common interests with each other than with their respective state capitals. Peninsula agriculture and maritime industries generate approximately $38 billion annually across all 3 state boundaries. Chicken farming dominates the agricultural economy, with companies like Purdue and Tyson operating massive processing facilities throughout the region. Commercial fishing, crab harvesting, and oyster farming create additional maritime economic activity that treats the peninsula as a single economic unit regardless of state political boundaries. Modern transportation and communication infrastructure has largely eliminated the geographic isolation that originally drove statehood movements. These modern connections make statehood less necessary for addressing peninsula residents' practical concerns, while potentially making independence more economically viable than ever before. But not every statehood movement faced such civilized political opposition. Some state governments responded to independence talk with threats that would make modern politicians blush. Westia, when Pennsylvania threatened death for statehood dreams. Number 10. Westia, first proposed in 1776. Pennsylvania's colonial government demonstrated exactly how far established authorities would go to crush independence movements. When Western settlers began organizing for statehood, the response wasn't negotiation or compromise. It was legislation, making secession advocacy punishable by death. This brutal crackdown instantly ended what could have become America's most successful early independence movement. The Westia proposal emerged from the geographic reality of 1770s Pennsylvania. The colony stretched from the Delaware River in the east all the way to the Ohio River in the west, creating a massive territory that was nearly impossible to govern effectively. Philadelphia sat comfortably on the Atlantic coast, connected to European trade networks and colonial political centers. But Western Pennsylvania existed in a different world entirely, a frontier wilderness where settlers faced constant threats from Native American raids, British allied forces, and the simple challenge of surviving in unsettled territory. These Western settlers weren't just geographically isolated from Philadelphia's government. They were politically abandoned. The colonial assembly was dominated by Eastern merchants and landowners who had little understanding of frontier conditions and even less interest in spending money to address Western problems. When frontier families begged for military protection against Native American attacks, Philadelphia politicians either ignored their requests or sent token forces that arrived too late to help. When settlers needed roads to transport crops to eastern markets, the assembly prioritized harbor improvements and urban infrastructure instead. The frustration reached a breaking point in the early 1770s as frontier violence escalated and Philadelphia's neglect became impossible to ignore. Western Pennsylvania settlers began holding informal meetings to discuss their grievances and explore options for political independence. These weren't radicals or troublemakers. They were farmers, merchants, and community leaders who had exhausted every legal avenue for getting attention from colonial authorities. Their discussions grew more serious as it became clear that Philadelphia would never prioritize Western interests over Eastern political concerns. By 1776, Western Pennsylvania residents were openly discussing secession and statehood, building on earlier 1775 petitions that had been rebranded as the Westlvania movement. They proposed creating a new colony that would stretch from Western Pennsylvania through parts of what would later become West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. The proposed boundaries followed natural geographic lines along the Appalachian Mountains and Ohio River, creating a territory that made far more sense politically and economically than Pennsylvania's unwieldy east-west expanse. The Westlvania movement gained momentum as the American Revolution began and colonial governments faced unprecedented challenges to their authority. Western settlers argued that if the American colonies could declare independence from Britain over taxation and representation issues, then Western Pennsylvania could certainly declare independence from Philadelphia over the same principles. They weren't being represented in colonial decision-making, and they were definitely being taxed to support government services they never received. Pennsylvania's response was swift, decisive, and terrifying. Rather than negotiating with Western representatives or addressing their legitimate grievances, the Colonial Assembly passed legislation in 1776, making advocacy for Westlvania statehood an act of treason punishable by death. Anyone caught promoting secession, organizing independence meetings, or even discussing the possibility of creating a separate Western colony could face execution as a traitor to Pennsylvania. This wasn't an empty threat designed to scare off casual dissidents. Pennsylvania authorities began investigating suspected Westlvania supporters and issuing arrest warrants for prominent Western leaders who had participated in independence discussions. The message was unmistakable. Philadelphia would rather execute its own citizens than lose control over Western territory and the tax revenue it generated. The death penalty threat worked exactly as Pennsylvania intended. Western settlers who had been willing to risk their lives fighting British forces or Native American raids weren't prepared to face execution by their own colonial government. The Westlvania movement collapsed almost overnight as organizers fled the territory, stopped attending meetings, or publicly renounced their independence sympathies. The territories that would have comprised Westlvania now house over 2.3 million people across parts of West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, and eastern Kentucky. These modern populations live in areas that still struggle with the same basic problem that drove the original movement: political and economic isolation from their state capitals. Coal industry decline has devastated local economies throughout the region, eliminating thousands of jobs and leaving entire communities economically stranded. The opioid crisis has further weakened these areas, creating workforce shortages and social problems that state governments seem unable to address effectively. Political voting patterns in these regions reflect the continued geographic and cultural divide that Pennsylvania's death threats temporarily suppressed. West Virginia has become solidly Republican with a CPVI of R+19, while western Pennsylvania counties also vote Republican in presidential elections, often by margins that contrast sharply with statewide results. The same forces that created the Westlvania independence movement in 1776 remain active across this territory in 2025, proving that Pennsylvania's threats of execution only delayed rather than resolved the fundamental problems. But sometimes, statehood movements came much closer to success than anyone expected. Franklin, the state that lost statehood by 2 votes. Number 9. Franklin, first proposed in 1784. Just 2 votes. That's all that stood between Franklin and becoming America's 14th state. Out of the dozens of failed statehood proposals throughout American history, none came closer to success than Franklin. The margin was so narrow that individual congressmen could have changed the entire course of American geography just by switching their position on a single vote. The Franklin story begins with one of the seediest political scandals of the early American Republic. North Carolina's political elite had discovered a lucrative scheme. They sold vast tracts of Western territory to political insiders at heavily discounted prices, knowing these well-connected buyers could flip the land to incoming settlers for massive profits. When settlers started comparing notes and discovered they had been systematically cheated by the very government officials who were supposed to serve their interests, the anger was immediate and explosive. Western settlers began organizing resistance to North Carolina's authority in 1784, proposing that all territory west of the Appalachian Mountains should secede and form an independent state called Franklin. The name honored Benjamin Franklin, whose reputation for integrity provided a sharp contrast to the corruption they were fleeing. Franklin would encompass roughly what is now eastern Tennessee, creating a territory large enough and populous enough to qualify for immediate statehood under federal guidelines. The Franklin independence movement gained momentum with remarkable speed. Settlers elected their own governor, established a functioning legislature, and began operating as an independent political entity while they pursued formal recognition from Congress. For nearly 4 years, Franklin functioned as a de facto independent state with its own laws, tax system, and government operations. They even negotiated treaties with Cherokee tribes and established diplomatic relations with Spanish authorities in nearby territories. Franklin's leaders submitted a formal statehood petition to Congress in 1785, confident they had built a strong case for independence. The territory met all the standard requirements for statehood's sufficient population, organized government, defined boundaries, and the ability to contribute to national defense and economic development. Franklin's representatives argued passionately that their territory deserved recognition as much as any existing state, and that continued subjugation to North Carolina's corrupt political system violated basic principles of representative government. The congressional vote on Franklin's statehood created intense drama as representatives from existing states wrestled with the precedent they would set by admitting a territory that had essentially seceded from an existing state. Some congressmen worried that recognizing Franklin would encourage other regions to pursue similar independence movements, potentially fragmenting existing states and destabilizing the young nation's political structure. Others argued that Franklin's case was unique because of the documented corruption that had driven their independence movement. When the final vote was counted, Franklin had fallen just 2 votes short of the 2/3 majority required for statehood admission. The margin was heartbreakingly close, so narrow that a few congressmen changing their minds could have completely altered American political geography. Franklin's representatives watched in stunned silence as their years of preparation and organization collapsed over a mathematical technicality that represented less than 5% of the total congressional membership.